Hello, I'm Dr. Vo. Welcome to today's discussion of the psychological makeup of racism, the deconstruction of racism, and providing healing for all. In the midst of worldwide pandemic, humanity is facing a second wave of pandemic, one that threatens the ultimate core sense of our beings. This wave forces us to look at our own mortality. United we stand, or divided we fail. Racism or equality for all. Hate or love for all. We can no longer pledge ignorance. We must force to take a stand, or our children's generation will be peril, and history will be splattered in blood. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. No one is free until everyone is free. Fannie Lou Hamer. The execution of Mr. George Floyd on the street sent shockwave all over the world. The truth of the matter is that police brutality and race supremacy have been prevalent from day one on Earth. One of the most well-known victims of police brutality is Jesus Christ, who was crucified on the cross. American freedom of speech and being the torchbearer of liberty and democracy, our act of police brutality became more transparent to the worldwide stage. In actuality, in anarchy, in a dictator and communist country, this is very much a part of the daily menu. Okay. When I was giving a presentation to students, I asked, anyone who thinks they are racist, please stand up. No one stand. Okay. When I ask if you know someone who is a racist, stand up. Lots of people stand up. When I ask if you want to be treated like a minority in this country, please stand up. No one stand up. So the reality is that we are aware that racism exists. We are aware that minorities, people, is having a hard time in this country, but we're not ready to acknowledge the racism, the prejudice, and the bias, the psychological cobwebs inside of ourselves. Okay, so racism starts with the person in the middle, which is you and I, before we became educated. Individual xenophobia is the fears and the prejudice against foreigners or people of a different color. Xenophobia created emotional trauma, intergenerational trauma, like the Holocaust. The trauma stored in the body, it changed the landscape of the mind, and it affects the topography of the brain. Research has shown that children that grew up in impoverished, lower socioeconomic group, they experience post-traumatic stress like combat soldiers in combat zones. Okay, so what is institutional racism? Individual xenophobia builds and hides behind institutional racism is the underlying socio-political practice in healthcare, education, in legal system to block, to deny privileges, to prevent advancement of minority group, leading to a marginalized existence. Black people in general experience higher rates of poverty, gun violence, single-family groups, maternity mortality, and incarceration than any other groups in the country. 1 out of 3 Black males is in jail, compared to 1 out of 5 white males is in jail. But the racial differences is substantial. There's only 13% of Black people in this country, and there are 60% of white people in this country. So the racial disparity in institutionalized setting is enormous. Black and other minority groups have always been underserved in mental health system, in public health care assistance, in educational system, due to demographic areas and due to their lack of resources. These minority groups are more vulnerable to communicable diseases, to COVID-19, due to their service in public transportation, sanitation, construction, or healthcare, etc. So individual xenophobia build up institutional racism. Okay, so individual xenophobia created a couple of consciousness that we call victim consciousness and perpetrator consciousness, because you have to have an abuser and an abusee. Okay, so for the first 7 years of life, how our consciousness and our paradigms of the world were created were based on the brain downloading from the environment. Evolution had designed for children's brainwave to be in theta wave. Theta wave in the hippocampal areas is provided for memory consolidation. So for the first 7 years of life, we are downloading the manuscript of how to become human. Okay. Albert Einstein said that the greatest decision we can make in life is to decide whether this is a friendly world to live in or it is a hostile world to live in. Research has shown that by the age of 7, children already have the paradigm of the world ingrained. Okay. So let's say a child who grew up in a lower socioeconomic group, whose father may be in jail, mother is working at 3 different jobs to raise up a single family unit. Child may be fearful, child may be hungry, afraid of when mom is going to come home the night before, not having dinner the night before. Child showed up in classroom, there's a pop quiz. Child failed the pop quiz the first time, failed again the next time. So child developed what is called internal attribute. I must be stupid. I must not have what it takes. I'm not as good as my classmate. This is called an internal attribute. From this internal attribute, society is going to reinforce the child mentality and belief about himself or herself, which is called external attribute. Okay. So from this internal attribute and external attribute of being retained, not having help at home, the child developed global attribute. I'm destined to fail. I never have what it takes. As a matter of fact, 90% of prison inmates were being told by someone in their life that they will amount to nothing and they're destined to be in prison, just like their father, their brother, their uncles. So the victim consciousness was very much part of the program downloading in an experiment by Dr. Mark Seligman, how it developed in animals. 1968, remember this is a pivotal years in history with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. assassination. Dr. Seligman divided 3 groups of dogs. The first group is called the control group, when the dogs were caged and released. Nothing was done to them. The second group was periodically shocked electronically. But these dogs had control over the environment. They can press a lever and then it can stop the shock. The second group of dogs were periodically shocked, but has no lever. They cannot stop the shock. So they protest in violence. They yell, they scream, they bite, they kick. But eventually something happened. They stopped responding altogether. They lay down and accept their fate. They're ready to die. Even when the cage were open and they're free to go, they wouldn't leave the cage. A victim consciousness was developed. This is the same concept when they trained animals. In the circus, a baby elephant was captured and chained to a tree by a rope. So baby elephant were taught to do trick. So when this baby elephant became an adult elephant, there's no rope that can chain an elephant. But she refused to leave because the rope has now internalized as a mental rope. And that rope is more powerful than anything in the external world. Okay, so these mental shackles, that's what keep victim in victimized position. So how did the perpetrator consciousness develop? Okay, two landmark studies. 1968, Jane Elliott, a white teacher, she recognized that the white reporters who reported Dr. Martin Luther King assassination reported it differently than the black reporters. So she took it on herself to conduct an experiment. She divided the students in her groups into two groups, the brown-eyed student and the blue-eyed student. So initially, she told the blue-eyed students that they were superiors, they are smarter than their counterparts, they can achieve, they can do anything in life. Miraculously, the blue-eyed children, including the underperforming, the average student, excelled, and they become top-notch in their classes. When she reversed the experiment, she told another group of brown-eyed children that they were superior than the blue-eyed children and they're destined for success. They indeed fulfilling her prophecy. Interestingly, one of the brown-eyed kids looked at Miss Elliott and say, well, teacher, if you say brown eyes is superior, how come you have blue eyes and you are a teacher? Another child stepped in and answered it as, well, if she had brown eyes, she would be a principal by now. So you can see confirmation bias, how we find things in the environment that confirming our belief system. We develop our paradigms based on self-fulfilling prophecy and what people told about us. Another powerful experiment, the Stanford Prison Experiment, 1971. When volunteer students were divided into two groups, one group is called the guard, and the other group was made to become prisoners. So the guard were told they had power over the prisoner. They start mentally torturing, inflicting pain onto the prisoner who previously were their classmate. Okay. So when they started out, they were all equal until they were told differently. Just like all babies were born cute, black, white, brown, Asian, yellow, okay, until they become adults. Then people stay away from them. So none of these experiments are legal now in the United States due to ethical issues. But what we learned in history, that's how perpetrator mentality developed. That's how Hitler was able to condition his officer and his soldiers to kill by installing a race supremacy mentality in their mind that give them the right to torture, to provide terroristic acts onto other human beings. Okay. So with the social looters and the racial monopolizer, those people who took advantage of the situation and providing transgressions, moral transgressions, and vandalism in society, they perpetuate the victim consciousness and being antithetical to the teaching, the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi regarding civil disobedience and peaceful protesting. Okay. So when you look at these victim and victor or perpetrator consciousness, a lot of people would say, well, that is due to the Black people mentality of inferiority. It had nothing to do with other people. It is self-created. The income disparity, the incarceration rate, and wealth lack of distribution as simply a result of poor choices. If only Black people try harder or took ownership of their decision or believe in themselves, then the disparity would not exist. Well, let me give you an example. Okay. In my 20s, I had 2 children at the time. I had 3 now. Okay. I was a college student pushing one child in a stroller and carrying another child on my backpack. I made an appointment to see an academic advisor. I was passionate and I was inspired to go to medical school. The academic counselor scrutinized my transcript and she stopped at a C that I made. And she said, "Why did you have this C?" I had to explain myself. And she said, "This C will kill people. You can't go to medical school." I was devastated. I didn't understand how my nearly perfect GPA was being held back because of the C. My entire future was crushed because of the C. But I didn't have any choice. I was powerless. She was the institution. She represented the gatekeeper for medical school. I believed in her. And so she looked at me and she looked at my children and she said, "Do you have plan B?" I said, "Well, okay, but my plan B was to go to graduate school and to obtain my degrees in psychology." Now, I had never regret my degrees. It turned out to be the most magnificent pathway ever for me. Okay. So I had no regret. But my story would be very different if the counselor at that time was a Black person. Minority people tend to promote and don't hold other minority back. There's a happy ending to my story. The child that I carry on my backpack that day, she went to medical school. She fulfilled my dreams and my mission. She became a medical doctor, an orthopedic surgeon. And she told me, "Mama, that's not true. There are people who had C in medical school, and there are people who had children in medical school." That is an example of how institutional prejudice can hold minority people back. Another example, When I became a hospital administrator, part of my job is to interview and select qualified candidates for different positions in the hospital. The president would often come to me and say, we need to have so-and-so position filled, would you select some candidates for me? So I would handpick the one that had the most experience, education, background, and all of that, presented to him. He would look through them and toss them out. He said, give me one that I can read their name. So I told him, I'm sorry, their name was not John Smith, but this is the highest qualified candidates I found. Okay. So behind the door of so many institutions, minority people will hold back because of their names, because of where they came from, not because of their qualities. Another funny example. I had a lovely, lovely elderly client. She was referred to me by her insurance. So the minute she saw me, she threw her hands in the air and she said, oh my God, my nail manicurist is Vietnamese, my hairdresser is Vietnamese, my laundromat person is Vietnamese, my home health care aide is Vietnamese, now my doctor is Vietnamese. Y'all just take over the country. I didn't get offended by that. I embraced her, and we sat down and talked about our ancestral history, our immigration history, how her ancestor came from Europe and mine on a boat. My parents and my siblings all came here on a boat. So we embraced our unity, our commonality, the love for freedom. Another example, in my work with the Immigration and Naturalization Services, the INS, so part of what I do, along with other medical doctors, is to assess and examine Vietnamese clients for the disability determination, to exempt them from the naturalization, the citizenship exam. So a lot of the Vietnamese people going through the war was injured, traumatic brain injury, spinal cord injury, lots of type of different injuries, and our countries as a field with motorcycles. So there's a lot of motorcycles injuries as well. If you have ever been traveling to Asian country, you know what I mean, okay? So I remember vividly, an officer told their attorney is that Vietnamese people are just lazy. They just don't want to study for the test. They just want doctors and lawyers to qualify them without making the effort of studying. Now, mind you, okay, these are not people fresh off the boat and trying to live off the system. These are taxpayer people who have been in this country, who have proved themselves to be capable citizens, but they just couldn't take the test because of their neurological deficits. Okay. So if Vietnamese people were lazy, in the past 45 years, when we first came to this country, we are now infiltrate every social echelons, every government rankings. We have 4-star general, we have astronaut, we have advisor to the president, we have doctors, lawyers, engineers, business owners, and yet some of the best manicurists. We excel in everything we do. So to globally attribute Vietnamese people are lazy, this is an illustration of individual xenophobia, which accumulated and turned into institutional racism. Okay. So, how do you, as an individual, stop the xenophobia and the mass implying force of prejudice out there in society? Well, it starts with the person in the mirror. There are 3 levels of racial awareness. The very first level is called racial illiteracy. That would be you and I before we became educated about prejudice. Okay. Before we recognize hundreds and thousands of lives, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., had laid down for our civil rights, for our ability to vote, for us to be equally sitting in restaurants and buying houses next to each other. Only in 1964, civil rights acts were passed, Jim Crow laws were disbanded. 1965, Voting Act allowed for all of us to vote. 1968, Fair Housing Act allowed for all of us to buy houses where we can afford. There's no longer a black people neighborhood, white people neighborhood, Asian people neighborhood. And we can be confident on the street of America. Okay. So, adopting another concept from the medical profession, which is called herd immunity, we can stop mass racism as well. Herd immunity is a concept that began in the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918. If enough people are being immunized and have antigen in their body, then the virus can stop on track. So let's say if all of our lives are like bowling lanes. Person number 1 is in lane 1, person number 2 is in lane 2, number 3 is in lane 3, and so on and so on. So if person number 1 became infested and passed on to person number 2, then person number 2 passed on to number 3, and so on and so on. Then we have a pandemic. But what if person number 1 was infested and trying to pass on to person number 2? Person number 2 with a strong immunity, with antigen, with antibody to fight back, then the virus stops right then and there. Make sure we are person number 2. Make sure that we and our children are educated, are aware of the black and white struggles in this country. Make sure that we don't pass judgment. Make sure that we understand the spiritual infinity in all of this. When we look at our physical attribute, it is finite. Okay? It is limited. But removing the physical vessel, who we are, is what Albert Einstein said, the field of infinite potentialities. So let us on embracing the wealth of who we are, the diversified menu of the human consciousness. Let us celebrate differences in each and every one of us. Let us not just go through history, but grow through history. Let us not involve, but evolve in evolution. Together, please embrace somebody outside of your cultural group. Please take the time to listen to a victim consciousness. Please embrace uplifting each and every one in our life. I wish you all love. Take care of yourself. I pray for Americans every day. God blesses this country. Thank you so much for my opportunity and my children's opportunity to be educated in this beautiful country for all.